November in New York has a particular kind of cold. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, finds the spaces between your coat and your collar, and stays there. In 1971, Greenwich Village wore that cold differently than the rest of the city. The streets there always seemed a little quieter, a little more forgiving, like the neighborhood understood that some people needed to move through the world without being recognized. Marvin Gaye had been in New York for 4 days when it happened. He wasn't supposed to be in the village that night. The Motown itinerary had him at a dinner with radio promoters on the Upper East Side, the kind of evening that involved too many handshakes and not enough honesty. Marvin had sat through exactly 40 minutes of it before slipping out a side door, hailing a cab, and telling the driver to just go downtown. He didn't have a destination. He just needed to not be where he was supposed to be. What's Going On had come out 7 months earlier. The album that Berry Gordy had called commercial suicide, the one Gordy refused to release until Marvin essentially held his entire career hostage over it. The album that had sold 2 million copies and changed what people believed soul music was allowed to say. Marvin should have felt vindicated, and on some days maybe he did. But on most nights, sitting alone in hotel rooms in cities that all started to look the same, vindication felt like a word other people used about you. It didn't warm you from the inside. The cab let him out somewhere around Bleecker Street, and he walked without a plan. There was a particular kind of freedom in that. Marvin Gaye, the artist, had an itinerary. Marvin, the man, could just walk. He passed restaurants and record stores and a bookshop with a hand-painted sign in the window. He wasn't looking for anything specific. And then he heard it. Piano coming from somewhere below street level. Not jazz exactly, not pop. Just someone who knew what they were doing, playing like there was nobody listening. He found the stairs going down. The bar was called The Owl, and it held maybe 30 people comfortably, which meant on a Tuesday in November, it held about 16 uncomfortably. The kind of place where the lighting felt intentional. Low and amber, barely enough. A small stage in the corner with an upright piano that had seen better decades. The smell of cigarette smoke and something being cooked in the back that nobody ever seemed to order. Marvin took a seat at the bar and ordered bourbon. He didn't notice John Lennon for a few minutes. That wasn't unusual. Lennon had a gift for making himself invisible in public spaces when he wanted to. He was sitting at a corner table with a glass of red wine and a notebook, wearing a black turtleneck and the kind of glasses that had become as much a part of his face as his nose. He wasn't writing in the notebook. He was just looking at it. The way you look at something when you're not really seeing it, when the page is just something for your eyes to rest on while your mind is somewhere else entirely. The man connecting them was a musician named Curtis Oakes. Nobody famous. He was the piano player that night, and he had worked sessions for both men at different points in the previous 2 years without either of them knowing it. He'd played background keys on 2 tracks from What's Going On and a session for Lennon's Imagine the year before that, one that never made the final cut. He spotted Marvin first from the piano bench. He finished the song he was playing, stood up, leaned toward the small microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, to a room that was barely paying attention, "I'm going to take a short break. Be right back." He went to Marvin first. They shook hands. Marvin smiled the way he did when he was genuinely pleased to see someone, which was different from his professional smile in ways that people who knew him well understood immediately. They talked for a few minutes, catching up on nothing important. Then Curtis gestured toward the corner table. "You know who that is, right?" Marvin looked over. He had never met Lennon. He knew the music, obviously. Everyone knew the music. But the British invasion and Motown had existed in parallel universes for most of the 60s, and their paths had simply never crossed. Marvin watched him for a moment. Lennon was still staring at the closed notebook. There was something in his posture that Marvin recognized without being able to name it right away. Not sadness exactly. More like exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long that they've stopped expecting anyone to notice the weight. Curtis went to the corner table, said something to Lennon. Lennon looked up, glanced toward the bar, and then did something unexpected. He closed the notebook, put it in his jacket pocket, and stood up. They met somewhere in the middle of the room, which in a bar that size meant they were basically standing next to the jukebox. Lennon extended his hand. "I know your record," he said. The one they didn't want you to make. Marvin looked at him for a moment. Which one? Lennon smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, the kind that meant he understood the question completely. Fair point, he said. They talked for a while standing there, then moved to the bar. Lennon switched to bourbon without being asked, which Marvin noted without saying anything. The conversation moved without a real beginning, just two men finding the right frequency. They talked about New York, about the particular weight of the city in autumn. Lennon had moved into the Dakota 3 months earlier. He was working on new music, though he said working loosely, with a pause before the word that suggested the reality was more complicated than the word implied. Marvin talked about the tour, about how performing felt different now than it used to, about how he would stand on stage in front of thousands of people and feel more alone than when he was sitting in his hotel room at 2 a.m. Lennon didn't offer any reassurance about that. He just nodded slowly, and the nod said everything that reassurance couldn't. At some point, Curtis came back to the bar and looked at both of them. He tilted his head toward the piano. You want to? He said to nobody in particular. The question could have been for either of them. It could have been for both. Lennon looked at Marvin. Marvin finished his bourbon. They didn't make an announcement. Nobody in the bar knew what was about to happen. Curtis sat down at the piano bench first and played a few soft chords, just getting the keys warm. Lennon pulled a bar stool close. Marvin stood slightly behind them both, arms folded, not quite ready, watching. Then Lennon started to play something, just with his right hand at first, a melody that didn't belong to any song Marvin recognized. It was slow and searching, the kind of phrase a pianist plays when they're thinking out loud rather than performing. Marvin listened. Curtis listened. The few people at nearby tables went quiet without fully understanding why. Then Marvin started to hum. Not words yet, just a note finding its place inside what Lennon was playing, the way water finds the shape of whatever holds it. Lennon heard it and his left hand came in, adding the root, grounding the melody, giving it somewhere to stand. Curtis felt where it was going and joined carefully, not leading, just following wherever the two of them decided to go. What came out of those three men wasn't a song in any finished sense. No verses, no chorus, nothing a producer would have recognized as usable. More like a conversation that happened to have notes in it. At one point, Marvin sang the words, "Every highway looks the same after a while," which wasn't a lyric from anything he'd recorded. He just sang it because it was true. Lennon heard it and answered with his own voice, quiet and dry, just underneath Marvin's. The way a second voice answers when it doesn't want to interrupt but can't stay silent either. Nobody in the aisle moved. The bartender, a man named Patrick who had worked that room for 11 years and had heard more live music than most concert halls ever would, said later that he stopped washing glasses and just stood there with a wet rag in his hand. He couldn't explain it except to say it sounded like two people who had been trying to say the same thing for years and had finally found a room small enough for the words to land. It lasted maybe 12 minutes, maybe 15. Nobody was counting. Counting would have meant thinking about time, and that would have broken whatever it was. When it ended the way it started. Gradually, Lennon's right hand played the melody down to almost nothing. Marvin's voice found a low note and stayed there for a moment, then let go. Curtis lifted his hands from the keys slowly, the way you lift your hands when you don't want the silence to feel like a sudden thing. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind that meant something had just happened, and everyone in the room was still inside it. There was no applause at first. After a few beats, someone near the stage began, and everyone else followed, but softly. More like an exhale than an ovation. Lennon stood up from the bar stool and looked at Marvin. He said something that nobody else in the room could hear. Marvin laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. The kind that comes from somewhere below the professional surface. He put his hand on Lennon's shoulder for a moment, the way people do when there isn't a better word for what just happened between them, and they know it. Nobody took a photograph. Nobody had a recording device running. The Owl didn't have a house tape system. What happened that night exists only in the memory of the 16 or so people who were there, most of whom spent the following decades being quietly disbelieved when they brought it up. Curtis Oakes talked about it once, in 2003, in a short interview for a music magazine that has since gone out of print. He said, I've played with a lot of people. I've been in a lot of rooms. But that night was different, and I can't tell you exactly why, except to say that both of them were carrying something they couldn't put down alone. And for about 15 minutes, they put it down together. John Lennon was shot 9 years later, in December 1980, in front of the Dakota. Marvin Gaye died in April 1984, one day before his 45th birthday. Neither of them ever mentioned that night publicly. There are no documents, no diary entries, no accounts from managers or publicists, because there were no managers or publicists in that room. Just a bartender who stopped washing glasses, a pianist who knew when to follow and when to stay quiet, and a handful of people who happened to walk down those stairs on the right night. The Owl closed in 1987. The building became apartments. The upright piano was donated to a church in Brooklyn, where it still sits in a back rehearsal room, slightly out of tune, in the kind of quiet it always deserved. Some things that matter most leave no record at all. The most honest music two people ever made together sometimes happens in a room too small for anyone to bother writing it down. And some nights, in the specific cold of a New York November, two men who understood exactly what the other one was carrying found each other at the bottom of a staircase. And for 15 minutes, the weight lifted just enough to breathe. The 16 people who were there that night carried it home with them. Most are gone now, but the ones who remain still remember exactly how the room felt when it ended. How nobody wanted to be the first one to move. How the amber light didn't seem to change, but everything inside it did.